Settlers meet the challenges of the prairies. The frontier settlers faced really extreme hardships, like droughts, floods, fires, blizzards, locust plagues, and even occasional raids by outlaws and early on Native American tribes. Yet the number of people living west of the Mississippi River grew from 1% of the nation's population in 1850 to almost 30% by this turn of the century. Dugouts and soddies. Since trees were pretty scarce, most settlers built their homes from the land itself. Many pioneers dug their homes into the sides of ravines or small hills, and sometimes just a stovepipe jutting up from the ground was the only clear sign that a dugout home was near. Those who moved to the broad, flat plains often made freestanding houses by stacking blocks of prairie turf, like a dugout, a sod home, or a soddy. Soddies were warm in the winter, cool in the summer. Soddies were small most of the time, though, and offered little light or air inside. They were havens for snakes and insects and other pests, and although they were fireproof, they leaked continuously when it rained. Virtually alone on the flat, endless prairie, homesteaders had to be almost superhumanly self-efficient, and women often worked beside the men in the fields, plowing the land, planting, harvesting the predominant crop, wheat. They sheared the sheep and carded the wool to make clothes for their family. They hauled water from wells that they had helped to dig and made soap and candles from tallow. At harvest time, they canned fruits and they canned vegetables. They were skilled in doctoring, from snake bites to crushed limbs. Women also sponsored schools and churches in an effort to build strong communities. They often also became victims of loneliness out on the prairie. It's said as much as a third to maybe even a half of people didn't stay long because they just couldn't stand the loneliness. This is a railroad depot downtown Centralia. Part of it still stands today, and on the bottom right you see George Washington. He was a mix. He was African American, not allowed legally to buy property, had to buy property through someone else to start the original homesteads that would become Centralia. There's brand new sculptures of George Washington and his wife and his dog downtown Centralia that was just unveiled about 2 months ago. Establishing a homestead was really challenging. Once accomplished, it was farming the prairie year in and year out. It became a really overwhelming task for many. It also developed a big market for mass big farm machines. We already talked a little bit about these farm machines, but here's a quick rundown again. In 1837, John Deere had invented the steel plow that could slice through heavy soil, and in 1847, Cyrus McCormick began to mass produce a reaping machine. But a mass market for these devices didn't fully develop until the late 1800s, with the migration of farmers onto the plains, and with this new technology coming down in cost. Other new and improved devices made farm work speedier, like the spring-toothed harrow, which could prepare the soil for planting, the grain drill to plant the seed in 1841, barbed wire, as you guys already know, to fence the land and protect it, and the corn binder in 1878. Then came the reaper that could cut and thresh wheat in one pass. By 1890, there were more than 900 manufacturers of farm equipment. In 1830, producing a bushel of grain took about 183 minutes, and by 1900, with the use of this big machinery, it only took 10 minutes. These inventions made more grain available for a wider market, but as you can imagine, it was also extremely expensive. Small farmers had a really hard time competing, and this led to the development of something called bonanza farms. Agricultural education. The federal government supported farmers in a couple of different ways, but partially by financing agricultural education. The Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 and of 1890 gave federal land to the states to help finance agricultural colleges. The Hatch Act of 1887 established agricultural experiment stations to inform farmers of new developments and new types of crop, plants, seeds, and crop rotations and things like that. Agricultural researchers developed grains for arid soil and techniques for dry farming, which helped the land to retain its moisture. These innovations enabled the dry eastern plains to flourish and become the breadbasket of the nation. Just FYI, there are a number of different Morrill Land Grant Act colleges, but WSU is one of them. So Washington State University was originally founded with that kind of money. It's also, to this day, one of the few places in the country where you can get a degree in organic agricultural practices. Now the problem, and this is how in part it's going to start to relate to the movie, in part these big machines were super expensive. It's like a computer in the 1950s. They were the size of the classroom and completely out of reach of the regular average American consumer. They were so expensive. So when these first big machines came into play, it was only people with money that could afford to buy them. And then once they bought them, they really had to gather as much acreage as possible to make use of these new machines and make them cost efficient and worthwhile. So it led to the development of something called bonanza farms. So elaborate machinery was really expensive, and farmers often had to borrow money to buy it. And when prices for wheat were higher, farmers could usually repay their loans, but when the wheat prices fell, farmers needed to raise more crops to make ends meet. This situation gave rise to a new type of farming. In the late 1870s, railroad companies and investors created bonanza farms. These were enormous single crop spreads of 15,000 to 50,000 acres, if you can imagine. The Caschini Dalrymple farm near Castleton, North Dakota, for example, covered 24 square miles. By 1900, the average farmer had nearly 150 acres under cultivation. Some farmers mortgaged their land to buy more property, and as the farms grew bigger, so did farmers' debts. Between 1885 and 1890, much of the plains experienced drought, and the large single crop operations could not compete with smaller farms, which could be more flexible in the crops that they grew. The bonanza farm slowly folded into bankruptcy. Farmers also felt pressure from the rising cost of shipping grain. Railroads charged Western farmers a higher fee than they did farmers in the East. Also, the railroads sometimes charged more for short hauls, for which there was no competition, than long hauls, which didn't seem to make any sense to the farmers. The railroads claimed that they were merely doing business, but farmers resented being taken advantage of. No other system of taxation is borne as heavily on the people as those extortions and inequalities of railroad charges, wrote Henry Demarest Lloyd in an article in March of 1881 in the Atlantic Monthly. Many farmers found themselves growing as much grain as they could possibly grow on as much land as they could possibly acquire, which resulted in going further into debt. But they were not defeated by these conditions. Instead, these challenging conditions drew farmers close together in a common cause. Last section for this chapter, farmers in the Populist movement. Just some of the reasons that farmers were having such troubles big expensive machinery, that it required huge farms in order to kind of make them worthwhile. I'm going to pause here while you look at this for just a second. Okay, I'm hoping you'll push pause for a second and try to figure out what this cartoon is meant to teach you. It works left to right and across, and then left to right on the bottom. So push pause if you like, because I'm about to explain it. So farmers, in an effort to kind of break even, bought more land so that they could produce more crops. But the problem with buying more land and producing more crops is it caused the price of the individual commodity, whatever it was, like wheat or corn or soybean, to fall. As a result, the farmer
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
bought more land, went into more debt, ended up with financial problems, and then on top of that, the railroad charged them whatever they wanted because there was no competition to ship their products. So for a variety of reasons, the farmers were in a lot of trouble. And initially, it seemed as if the farmers were making bad short-term decisions, as far as supply and demand are concerned. In the late 1800s, many farmers were trapped in this really vicious economic cycle. Prices for crops were falling. Farmers often mortgaged their farms so they could buy more land to produce more crops. Good farming land was becoming scarce. Banks were foreclosing on mortgages of increasing numbers of farmers who couldn't make payments on their loans. Moreover, the railroads were taking advantage of farmers by charging really excessive prices for shipping and storage. The farmers had little option but actually to pay it, because what are they going to do? Some of the reasons for this economic distress that happened. The troubles of the farmers were part of a larger economic problem that was affecting the entire nation. So during the Civil War, the United States had issued almost $500 million in paper money called greenbacks. Here's a greenback down here. Greenbacks could not be exchanged for silver or gold money. They were worth less than hard money of the same face value. Hard money would have been gold and silver coin. Hard money included both coins and paper money, which was printed in a yellow ink that could be exchanged for gold. Now, after the war was over, their government began to take the greenbacks out of circulation because they knew they were going to cause some problems. So they retired the greenbacks. Retiring the greenbacks, this is a blanket made out of old greenbacks, believe it or not. Retiring the greenbacks caused some discontent because it increased the value of money that stayed in circulation. Once they pull all of that old money out, there's less currency out there on the market, and it's just supply and demand. Now that there's less of it, the value of the money goes up. So it meant that farmers who had borrowed money when money was cheap, this is kind of hard to follow, were now responsible for paying back their loans in dollars that were worth more than the dollars that they had borrowed. Okay? At the same time, the money that they were receiving, they were receiving less money for their crops. For example, between 1867 and 1887, the price of a bushel of wheat fell from $2 to 68 cents. So in effect, the farmers seemed to be losing money at every turn. Throughout the 1870s, the farmers and other debtors pushed the government to issue more money into circulation. Those tactics failed. Although the Bland-Allison Act of 1878 required the government to buy and coin at least $2 million to $4 million worth of silver each month, it wasn't nearly enough to support the increase in the money supply that farmers wanted. Last piece. Oh, problems with the railroad. Hopefully I get to that. Meanwhile, farmers paid outrageously high prices to transport grain. Lack of competition among the railroads meant that it might cost more to ship grain from the Dakotas to Minneapolis by rail than from Chicago to England by boat. Also, railroads met secret agreements with middlemen, grain brokers, and merchants that allowed the railroads to control grain storage prices and influence the market price of crops. Farms started